Welcome. The obvious place to start is what is dry eye? And if we're going to focus on why we are here, what is a group of conditions and how do they manifest themselves? How do they overlap? How do we select certain disease subgroups to match our new chemical entity or our repurposed drug? Because what's broken needs to be matched with what could fix it. Undoubtedly, at the end of the day, this is an area that will accommodate polypharmacy in the disease category and perhaps even polypharmacy within individuals. After much discussion amongst a dozen of the speakers, we put together the definition of dry eye that you see before you, taking into consideration the fact that there are a multiplicity of underlying etiologies and that they manifest themselves in a multiplicity of signs and symptoms and chemical and cellular alterations. Each of those leads to distinct profiles of endpoints that have to be defined and time points that have to be measured and will differ, of course, from subgroup to subgroup. These are the issues: to find an agent that in a disease that has certain signs and symptoms, an agent that will modulate and improve those signs and symptoms. And what works for one category undoubtedly will not work for another. And we have to look at what we have done wrong to this point in time and what we need to do going forward. The purpose is really to make certain that the cornea is protected, that incredible tissue to which a number of us here have devoted our entire existence, even though it's a little 13 millimeters by 1 millimeter disc. It's amazing how much we still don't know about it. This is a side view of the cornea, the epithelium on top and the stroma, but more importantly, this is what it looks like head on. This is why we're here, to protect this incredible surface that allows us to see, that allows us to maintain the perfection of the optical surface of an oil on water, on mucin, on epithelial membrane that produces a 20/15 or maybe even a 20/8 visual function. The Hubble satellite has nothing on our ocular surface. How do we maintain that perfection, both for comfort and visual function? And how do we improve the quality of the millions of people who have variations of defects in this process? Briefly, one can look at a couple of categories that need to be addressed and are obvious subgroups that have to be controlled and identified for. Certainly the lid margin. 120 modified sebaceous glands, and you can see a couple of them. Normal on the left and the abnormality on the right. You can see the abnormality of the cornea epithelium. It's pretty hard to have a normal ocular surface tear film if your lids either blink, we'll be talking about, the shape of the lid margin, or the quality of the meibomium glands. One of the most amazing things, if you think about it, is this gland produces dozens of different lipids and waxes and oils in a particular ratio. How does it know that? That allows it to be clear and of a viscosity that, as we squeeze, moves its way onto the ocular surface and produces the film that keeps this tear film in place, that prevents evaporation, and maintains that perfection of visual function. The lacrimal gland produces the bulk of the tear film, and that's hidden under the upper lid. A substantial gland. This is the only disease to date where we allow a gland, and there's no other gland in the body, that we allow it to become inflamed to the point where it loses its function, and we don't treat that to date, although some companies here and some projects here and some drugs addressing that. We don't treat that inflammation. We let the gland turn into a nubbin, and then we replace the incredible constellation or cocktail of products that are contained in our tear film with a polymer and a little salt water, bearing no resemblance to what was lost. We can do better. We all have that responsibility here to do better. The goblet cell is probably the other part of that three-partated system that maintains the coating. Again, over a dozen different mucins. Mucins that span cells, mucins that float in the aqueous. Each of them has a critical role in a critical ratio to maintaining this perfect system. How do we improve the function of the goblet cells and their numbers? And there are drugs out there that we're starting to look at. There are other new chemical entities. Will we repurpose drugs that are being used in Japan for gastric ulcers? Will there be other agents that can improve not just the secretory function of the goblet cell, but their numbers and the types of mucins? Certainly this will be something that happens in the future. This is from Darlene's Dart. She'll be talking about this. This is the mucins that come out of the goblet cell, and this is a close-up view of one very large goblet cell. The complexity is just astounding. Superimposed on all of this is the inflammation, the secondary inflammation that occurs when you have an irritated surface. And the inflammation represents another important target because there are final common pathways. Whatever's broken initially, there are secondary effects of inflammation. There are secondary and tertiary effects of being unable to respond to an appropriate environment that are shared in common by all these diseases, regardless of the initial etiology. This is a patient post-LASIK to remind us that the nerves are critical. There is no tissue in the body more innervated than the cornea. Does it trigger blink? Does it trigger protection? Does it trigger reflex tearing? Does it trigger increased aqueous and mucin production? Is it critical in controlling the mitotic rate of epithelial cells and the renewal of that surface? Absolutely. There are patients who, after LASIK, have the equivalent of phantom limb pain, maybe phantom corneal pain. How rare that is. But there are diseases as form frusts of Riley-Day syndrome with missing mediators like beta-hydroxylase deficiencies that may also point to a subgroup of disease with decreased, not fully decreased, but subtly decreased sensation, which can lead to the cascade of problems that may affect all the various cell types that produce a tear film. Let's not forget the environmental causes. We'll be discussing the nutrition, hydration, fatigue, visual focus, medication, humidity, wind velocity. All of these are factors that, if not properly controlled, can overwhelm the effects in the short term of certain diseases, make the placebo look better, and not give our drug the fair chance it deserves. Going forward, nailing Jell-O, wasn't easy finding this one. Nailing Jell-O to the wall is not an option. We can do better. Successful study design will be based on everything we've talked about to date. We have to understand the mechanism of action, match it to the subgroup, the appropriate study design protocol models, the appropriate time points, endpoints that are appropriately surrogated, and navigate all this in a cost and time-efficient manner in a regulatory environment that appropriately answers the question, have we passed? And I think I don't want to summarize Dr. Chambers' talk, but we all know, do they pass the so what test? And that is, are we making a difference? And that's important for the market, it's important for sales, but it's also important for our metrics. In summary, to dive into this, we're very excited to have 26 of the key opinion leaders in this area and 160 of the central figures in the dry eye industry here, and that's the participants and the speakers. Together, hopefully today, we can have some strategic ahas, make some strategic relationships, and maybe learn some strategic lessons. Thank you very much.